All right. So let's get started. So we get to talk about or just share with you the propagation environment and the environment as far as now that you are trying to propagate things. What are some of the things that you need to consider? What are some of the things that you need to know? And what are some of the things that are going to be influencing the plant? So that's what the environment is going to be talking about. So, uh, so when we look at the environment, we are going to be looking at a plant. And so there's going to be a lot of things that are going to affect the plant. So we can divide the plant into two segments. The atmospheric, which is going to be the above the ground, the green portion, and the edaphic, which is going to be below the soil, which is going to be the roots and or the soil and anything below the ground. So when we're looking at plants, light is going to be very important. And so when we planted some of the seeds, as you are doing research may require some light or not, as well as plants in order for them to be happy and healthy and grow evenly, they're going to require light. The temperature is going to be very important. Too high temperature, growth is going to stop. Too low temperature, growth is going to stop. They're going to like warm temperature, and sometimes non-tropical plants or temperate plants might like something that is going to be a little bit more cold. Gas, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Oxygen because plants do breathe. Carbon dioxide is going to be necessary for photosynthesis. And ethylene, which is going to be a plant hormone, we'll talk about that in more detail later, is also going to be very, very important. That's going to be cause maybe some negative consequence on the plant if it's not careful. You're not careful with it. Water, humidity. Make sure you water the plants, or plants are well watered, lots of humidity, so that they don't suffer any stress, so that they do the leaves. And different biological means, there's going to be pathogens, there's going to be insects, there's going to be other things that are going to be affecting the plants. They could be eaten, they could cause it to rot. And so that's sort of things you need to consider. When we're looking at the soil, the media needs to be fluffy. It needs to retain water, but it also needs to have air. And so having oxygen and carbon dioxide in the root system is also going to be important, as well as the ethylene that could cause problems later on. Water needs to be present in the root so that it can be absorbed, and the plant is going to then be able to absorb it and carry out its biological function. The different media or soils. So when we are growing plants in a container, we are not really using soil. Soil is when you're going to be planting things in the ground. Whenever we're growing things in a container, we're going to use media, which is plural. Medium is going to be singular. And we have used a planting medium for your seeds. We have used a fern medium for your ferns. And later on, we're going to do a special medium for your cuttings. So just be aware when wherever we use the word medium or media, it's going to be a man-made recipe for achieving whatever we're trying to achieve. There are different types of propagation flats and or liner, the containers that we are using. Some of them will have positive or negative impacts on some of those plants. So be aware of that. And then minerals and or nutrition. We have not had a need to fertilize plants, but later on we'll use organic fertilizers so that the plants are going to have whatever necessary elements for them to continue on growing and be happy. And also biotic living organisms that are going to live in the soil. So there's pathogens, there are fungi, there's bacteria that could have a negative impact, as well as the mycorrhiza or beneficial organisms that we can inoculate some of the roots before we plant them into a bigger container. And that's going to make our plants happier and stronger and a lot more robust. So few things for you to consider when we're looking at some of those. When we're looking at light, we know that light is going to be the most important factor for the plants to be happy and be alive, because light is going to initiate the photosynthesis. The photosynthesis, which is going to take very simple materials like carbon dioxide and water, and using the pigment, the green pigment, the chlorophyll, is going to carry out a chemical process that will result in glucose or sugar that will then be stored or used for the biological functions or for energy for the plants to grow. The waste product is going to be oxygen. So without light, plants are not going to be able to generate the sugar or the glucose to feed themselves, and potentially could starve to death. So that is why light is very, very important. When light is present, then water can be used. Without light, then there's no need for the water. So the light affects the growth rate, also the shape and the form of the plant. So be aware of that. And the direction. So sometimes you have unilateral plants that are running away from the shade and reaching towards the window, reaching to higher light. So it's important out the entire area. As well as the coloring, the pigments, some of the yellow, some of the red, some of the green. Going to be important. Flowering and fruiting, or going dormant. So right now I'm already leaf, and in a couple of months they're going to drop all of their leaves and they're going to be completely dormant. So the amount of light that they receive is very important. It's also important for seed germination. So some seeds will require light and some will require darkness, and that's very important. So when the seeds are dropped to the ground, the action of being buried will be a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And until they are away from the sunlight, then the seed will know that it is now underground, and that's going to trigger the germination. Or vice versa, sometimes the seeds are buried too deep and they're going to wait until somebody tills the soil, somebody digs them out, and then eventually they're going to germinate as they get closer to the surface. This happens a lot with weeds. So when somebody tills the soil, and then eventually in a couple of days you have a lot of weed seeds up the soil, maybe too deep, and that they are tilled, and you bring them closer to the surface. Guess what? They are now in close proximity to the surface. More light will get to them. Now they're going to germinate. So some seeds will require light, some seeds will require darkness. So it's important for you to start looking at which seeds you have and as well. So the water needs to be plentiful. Keep in mind that all of the water is going to be held by the soil particles, and the smaller the container, the quicker it's going to dry. The smaller the container and the quicker that the roots are going to be growing into the media, the quicker that the water is going to be absorbed. So having really important, a serious dry out on any of them will cause them to die. And misters will work. Here's the example of Monrovia has a corral with a regular mist system, a corral that every couple of minutes, it'll just turn on for a few seconds. And that's enough for the plants. Are greenhouses necessary around Southern California? The answer is no. However, greenhouses are very popular in Europe where it gets cold. So Around here, the main problem is not going to be the cold. The main problem is going to be the heat, the opposite. So many greenhouses, if they are not well ventilated, they are going to get very hot, cooking the plants and raising the temperature to the point that it's going to be harmful to the plant instead of helpful. So most greenhouses or most nurseries around here are going to use some kind of plastic or what is known as a hoop house or a tunnel. And it's a very simple construction, but that is what's going to work for them here in Southern California. However, if you want to have a greenhouse and you need to cover it, nothing is going to beat glass. So it is expensive because, and it's also heavy. So a greenhouse, if you want to get them from Costco, they're small. They are a kit that they already pre-made. You just assemble them and you can get them out of glass and they're going to be good. Glass is going to be the best covering for your greenhouse because it's going to allow the most amount of sunlight to go through. However, it's going to be the most expensive and it's going to be the most heavy and it's also going to be the most fragile. So you don't want to have rocks or anything being thrown next to the greenhouse because some of those panels are going to be very expensive. But you got to make sure that you have some kind of ventilation to help with that. Most areas around here will just have a simple polyethylene, which is nothing more than clear plastic. If you're going to use plastic, it is very important that you get what is referred to as the UV rated plastic because those are going to last for an average of about 3 years. If they're not UV rated, they're going to be gone in about 2 or 3 months. So it's just a little bit expensive, but a little bit more expensive, but it's worth it because you're going to be having the plastic for a while. So a simple hoop house, either made out of wood or made out of PVC, polyvinyl carbon, the plastic and cover. And this is just either to protect some of the more tender tropical plants, being from a nursery. If they look better, they can still sell them, or to speed up some of those plants that are going to require a little bit more warmth. So they're going to get them started in a protected environment, and they're going to grow a little so that as temperature change, they're already going to be well underway. And when they're able to tolerate the outdoor environment and it's nice and warm, then they're going to be ahead of the game in the market and sell their plants. So that is why you would see some of this, or people will use some of this. We have some of the polycarbon or some of the newer developments in plastic. So some of this clear plastic that you can find out there. It's good. As time goes by, they're going to start to turn dull in color, limiting the light that is going to go through the plants. But it's going to be good for 10 years, good 10 years. So not that expensive. They're very light and they will do the job. So if you have an option, that would be good as well. Or for many years, people have used fiberglass, and that is what our greenhouse is covered with. The fiberglass that will allow a good amount of light to go through, and it's going to last for 15, 20 years. And as time goes by, then the sun is going to take its toll on the fiberglass, and then less amount of light is going to go through. But fiberglass is still a very good way of having a greenhouse. Regarding benches, many choices. Many nurseries will keep their plants close to the ground. There is some benefits and some drawbacks to that. The benefits is that plants that are close to the ground are not going to dry as quickly. So if there's a heat spell, you can just water them, they'll survive. When you elevate the plants and put them on a bench, then they're going to have a lot of air circulating and they're going to dry quicker. The negative to having them close to the ground is that pathogens can splash from the soil, from the ground onto the plants when you have water or when you rains or when you water them. But if you don't have benches, Many nurseries will grow them in the ground quite well. If you're going to use benches, some of the plastic that we have here are going to be very, very good. Plastic is not going to allow a lot of the pathogens to take hold, and you can just wash them and disinfect them every once in a while, and you're set. So plastic would be some of the better material. If nothing else, you're going to have some of wooden benches. Some people will make them out of the old pellets that are going to be thrown away. They're good for a couple of years. They will eventually rot, but they're going to keep a lot of humidity and mold and a bunch of other pathogens that are not going to be good for your plants. The best benches are going to be the ones that are movable, keeping in mind that as you begin to propagate plants, it is going to be very, very easy for you to fill an entire area. And so nurseries are constantly fighting for more space, constantly fighting for areas to grow plants. And any walkway, any space between benches is a waste of space for them because that could be used for growing plants. And so some of these movable benches in the middle that you can move them, you only have one aisle. And as you move the benches from left to right, you just generate a new aisle wherever you need it. And that's it.
Regalo.
So that's going to be one of the best if you can find them. They're, once again, more expensive, but at the end, it is worth it. Some people will recommend bottom heat for propagation, bottom heat for some of the tropical plants. If it's really cold around here, it will help to germinate seeds a lot sooner. And if we're a nursery and we're fighting the market, then that could be a good thing. Or it is going to be very helpful for propagating with cuttings. So having the base of the cuttings nice and warm is going to be good. That's going to speed up the rooting process by several weeks. Also, there will be certain plants that we're going to classify as difficult to propagate through cuttings, that it is going to be extremely important for them to have bottom heat. And as they've done research, it is only with bottom heat that they've been successful in propagating them. So for commercial production, yes. For most of you, any other, again, you can do with or without. Here in Southern California, it's warm enough that you don't really need it. But if you want to speed up, then great, you can do so. Fan and cooling, I mentioned that in Southern California, the worst case is going to be when temperature becomes really hot. If it's summer and we have a heat spell, temperatures within the greenhouse are going to be in the upper 100s and or more. So it is important to find a way to cool off the plants, and that way they're not going to suffer and or cause the heat cause them some damage, and they're going to continue on growing. So the quickest way is going to be this fan and cooling method. So in the back of the greenhouse, there is a cardboard that will get soaked with water. And in the front of our greenhouse, we have a fan. So as the air gets pulled in from the back of the greenhouse through the cardboard and the water, it's going to cool down the air. And as the air is pulled towards the front of the greenhouse, it's going to cool the surrounding area around the plants. So the hot air is pulled out from the front, and new cool air is pulled in from the outside as it goes through this, the pad pads in the back. So that's the fan and the pad method. Some nurseries or smaller greenhouses will use like a swamp cooler. That's also acceptable. Other nurseries will use some kind of mist system just to raise the humidity and cool down the plants. For larger greenhouse, something like this is going to be good. So shade cloth, it is very important for plants to get acclimated. The word acclimated, you should become familiar with it. Acclimated or harden off. So plants that are grown in a greenhouse are going to be weak because they have not been exposed to the solar radiation or the sunlight. And if you were to take a plant from the greenhouse and put it in sunlight, it'll get burned and it'll probably die. So gradually, the plants needs to be exposed to higher levels of sunlight. And so you will take them from a greenhouse that is protected from the sunlight to a shade structure or a shade house. Depending on the shade, the cloth that you use, they sell them with different percentage of shade. So from 80% to 60% to 50%, 30%, you can get whatever percentage you want. So once the plants have spent several weeks in a shade house, now being exposed to the sun, then you can now put them in the sunlight or full sun. And then now by that time they're acclimated, they're used to the sunlight. They have gotten their cells and or their cuticle or their skin to be tougher. And now they're not gonna burn and they're gonna be safe. So make sure that you acclimate, you harden up the plants if they have grown in a greenhouse during their entire life. And then propagation liners. There's going to be several of them depending on the plants. So we already use some liners or we're using liners for our seedlings. And there are nurseries that specialize in simply growing liners. So the best example is going to be the Plug Connection. That is the name of a company in San Diego. They are going to take seeds and plant them in tiny plugs or tiny flats, and they are going to sell those to the nurseries. So they only keep the plants for just 3-4 weeks. And if they keep them longer, that product is not good for them. So that is their entire business, just create plugs. Germinate the seeds, do the cuttings, get them for a couple of weeks, sell them. Then the nurseries, the growers will take those plugs, put them in larger containers, and then offer them to the wholesalers or to the retailers or to the public. So there's going to be a business for everybody. So different liners that you can purchase, some deeper for trees because they're going to have deeper roots, or their roots are going to grow quicker, to some of the more tropical, and some for the annual colors that you see around there. Different flats or carrying trays, two main ones. On the left, we have a seedling tray that we'll use later for making cuttings, making a communal flat. On the right, we have one that has wider holes. That is a carrying flat. So you would put containers or pots, and they'll carry usually 16 4-inch containers or what they refer to as 6-packs. So different, and there's going to be different sizes. The squares are going to be the more popular, but there's going to be some that are going to be a little bit narrow and or bigger, and depending on the company, there may be a few others here and there. Clay pots for growing plants is not really recommended. Some people like for succulents, but even for growing succulents for a prolonged period of time, they're not really that good because they are going to be very airy and many plants will dry out very quickly. So they look good when they are planted with succulents, but if you are a grower and having a lot of clay pots, it's not going to be good. So be aware of that. Or the paper pots. The big movements towards using less waste, moving away from plastic. You may see at your local retailers they offer herbs in paper cups or paper pots that you would bury the pot in the soil and it will decompose and become fertilizer. However, for growing the plants, it is very difficult. So in most cases, the growers are going to grow it in like a plastic liner, and then they'll transplant them to the paper pots before they get sent to the retail market. So for the selling point, for the marketing, it is very good. It's a feel-good type marketing. But for growing plants for a long time, the paper is going to get wet, the paper is going to get mushy, the paper is not going to hold. There are now new pots that are made out of bamboo or rice husk that are going to be a lot better. They are as good as plastic and they're biodegradable and there's a renewable resource. So we can look into those later on. But just be aware of some of these paper pots that are out there and don't fall for that. And then for cuttings or for seeds, there's gonna be some peat moss or peat pots. These are pre-made and we'll use them later on, where you would add some water and they will expand so that you can either put your seed or plant your seed or plant a cutting. When we mix our media for cuttings, it's gonna be sponge rank and peat moss, or if you're doing a few things and you wanna do it at home, you can get yourself some of these peat pellets that will come in a plastic container, and you can use them to grow your plants. A lot of nurseries, when they're gonna use or grow a very expensive plant, they may use an oasis type material. This have actually gone very high in price, and that is because the marijuana industry has started using them as well for propagating marijuana through cuttings. So either oasis foam or sometimes some other synthetic fiber, so kind of cubes made of synthetic fibers, or a couple of other things. You can keep it moist. You can grow cuttings well in them, and it's just an extra or a different medium that you can use for growing cuttings or seeds or something else. So that is also available. But here's some examples of failures where they dried out and now they're gonna be chucked and thrown away. Now, we don't have this in the US, or we lost it, but before the development of the rigid plastic, you had plastic bags, and I think they're coming back. I've seen some fiber bags that are also being used for some vegetables to grow small plants. But plastic bags in areas where you don't have the luxury of the rigid containers is how they're gonna grow plants. And this is gonna be as good as some of our containers. Even our plastic rigid containers have gone very low in quality. So I remember many years ago, they were rigid, they lasted a long time. And now they use a method of stretching the plastic that makes it very thin, and they're almost, and they're good for just a very short amount of time. So be aware of that, because if you want to use some of these plastic containers, they are good for space or save space if you are missing or having need for that. So here is the typical steps that your plants need to take. So depending as you grow from cuttings or from seeds, it is very important that once those seeds germinate, or the cutting root, that you put it in some kind of liner with just a small amount of soil. You don't want to put a tiny cutting or a tiny seedling in a very large pot, because it's not going to be able to absorb all the moisture and all the humidity from the soil or the media. So when the seedling or cutting gets completely or fills out the liner, then you can transplant it into a 4-inch container. 4-inch container, either square or round, depends on the type of plant. Once the soil is completely full of roots, then you can give it more space by transferring it into a 1-gallon container. From the 1 gallon, you can do the 2-gallon, 3-gallon, eventually making it into 4. However, many plants that grow very quickly, you can bypass the 2 or the 3-gallon and go from the 1 to the 5. And as you grow different plants and as you figure out which one can grow better or worse, you can start to see where you can skip some of those steps. But if we were going to look at the steps that the plants are going to take. So on the top, we have propagation by cuttings. So we are going to use a communal flat, meaning that we're going to take many cuttings and we're going to put them all in one flat, maybe 300 cuttings. And they're just going to be there for a couple of weeks until they root. Many nurseries will bypass this, and they will then grow them directly into the container. Or the seed propagation, that we can also use a communal flat just to grow a bunch of seeds. Later on, we can thin them out and eventually put each of those seedlings into a liner, or grafting or tissue culture, as we all do later on. And then we're gonna have a liner, or they're gonna grow in a liner for several weeks or several months. And then eventually they're gonna go into the larger container, into the production. Or if this was a field crop like trees, they can go directly into the ground so that they can start growing, and eventually they're gonna be harvested for wood or for other wood-like products. So you can go from follow those steps. Or if you nursery like Monrovia or some of the other big nurseries like Village, they will bypass the communal flat or the first step. So they are going to direct root the plants in a pot or in a container with the soil. Because putting the plants in a communal flat will disturb the roots when you remove them. And that's going to slow down the process or slow down the time and do a little bit of damage to the roots. So by avoiding disturbing the roots and planting them directly into the 4-inch container, then that speeds up the process. It's all about time and speed to get the product out into the nursery as quickly as possible. It's possible because they use or they disinfect the media that they're going to use for the plants to root. And once the plants are placed in the media to root, they will follow a very rigorous process of spraying the plant with fungicide to avoid any contaminants, to avoid any pathogen from attacking the plant. So it is tedious. It is requires the use of chemicals. But that is how many of the larger nurseries are going to get away with having and producing a lot of plants for the industry. So direct rooting, that's going to be there. And then from there, they can be placed into the larger containers and offered to the public, or they can go straight into the field for production. So we are going to use the top. We're going to use a communal flat. We're going to use the liners, and then eventually it's going to go into a 4-inch that you can then take home, or into a gallon that you can then take home. So that's going to be our steps. So I mentioned the plug connection. So here's just examples of how some of the nurseries are propagating plants. So very tiny liners. So there is a machine that will fill the liner with media. It will then put a seed, one seed into each of those cells, cover it, and water it all in a couple of steps. And then somebody picks it up at the other end and then allow the seeds to germinate. And when they are germinated and they're there for several days, then they can be sold to the growers. So hundreds of flats are produced and sold every single year. Here are some of the liners that are now too old for them. So like any agricultural product, there's a shelf life. And so some of those liners that the plant is now too big, for most nurseries, that's not acceptable. So in this case, we went there because they were donating them to us. We can grow them, we can care for them a little bit more, and then we can use them for our program. So those geraniums with flowers are too old for them. Here's a couple of other plants. So they are propagated mainly through seeds. However, they can also do cuttings, or they've been able to do cuttings. Different types of grasses, asparagus fern, coral bells, kangaroo paws, here in the tiny liner. And here's just the brand new ones that are just set to germinate. And there's a misting system, so they get water on a regular basis, and they're not allowed to dry out. And here on the left, you also see a heating pad. Not that they use it, but sometimes they have trials that they would use it to see how good they would germinate. And here's their benches, nothing more than just tubes. They don't need much, and so That's all they have, very simplistic. There's some of the workers that are either cutting or making the cuttings for the next production, or they are eliminating some of the plants that are not good, or checking the product, the quality of the product to make sure. That time. So just the benches right there, and more of the product right here, and small walkways and different view right here. This would be a tropical houseplant nursery, Callisto growers. They take advantage of every single inch of space they have, and that's going to be very important because every plant is valuable. So plants barely touching each other, make sure that there's enough light, as we talked about in the beginning. So some of the pothos here, they are being directly planted into the pot. So they take 5, 6, 7, 10 cuttings, leaf cuttings with a single node that we'll do later on, put it in a pot, it'll root, it'll grow, and so you simply put a hanger, and now you have a hanging plant. So very easy for them to do and bypassing any other method. So direct stick into the 6-inch container to create that hanging basket. Even the goldfish plant, direct stick, several cuttings, and in a couple of weeks, it's already a sellable product. Some of the plants that are taller than maybe subject to toppling because they're top heavy, they bury a pot and they will then drop it so that it doesn't fall to the left or to the right. And when they need it, just lift that plant and take it to the loading dock to be sent out. They also do the dracaenas. So some of these stems, they get them from Hawaii, and because they have no soil, they get brought in pallets, literally bundles of those sticks in pallets, and all they do is they put them into a 1-gallon container with a little bit of peat moss to root them out. Once they are rooted out, then they can put 3 to a larger container, and that's how they will create a fuller, bigger plant. And so here's where the cutting that is bare root, since it's bare root, has no soil, it's very easy for agriculture to accept them. And pallets upon pallets are shipped over from Hawaii and South America, and they are already fully grown, whatever size you want, and just root them out. In a couple of weeks, you already have a sellable product out there. So, and some of the peace lily, and mentioned taking advantage of the space, and that's going to be the top where they have hanging plants just because they need to grow and need a place to grow. So peace lily, or also leaf propagation. So we'll get to do leaf propagation later on. These are ZZ plants, and take a bunch of leaves, put them in liners. Eventually, as the plants grow and root, a new baby plant will come out, and those are then transplanted into a larger container and grown for a couple more months or years, and eventually it is going to be a sellable product. So leaf propagation in a liner right there. And we also have nurseries that grow a lot of the ground cover. So you go to Home Depot and you have flats of ice plant and or other succulents. Most of those are going to come from LT growers in Ontario. And that's where when I visit them, I took these photographs. Nothing more than just a bunch of shade house and the flats that are set to root and grow before they are delivered to the retailers. Here's a few other plants. And here's a bunch more. So some of the orange ice plant and the yellow ice plant. And when you are going to be growing plants, it is very important for you to have access to what is referred to as the foundation stock or the mother stock, meaning where are you going to get your cuttings from? Because buying cuttings could be quite expensive. So if the nurseries are able to grow the plants somewhere in the vicinity where they can then go and take cuttings, it makes it a lot better. So for LT growers, LBT, they have their own field somewhere in the back, and they plant the ice plant. And when they need it, they send somebody over to start getting the cuttings. So here is their foundation stock in the back area. And here are some of the hypericum and some of their thyme and a bunch of other of those ground covers. The gazania, so growing in the ground. And what they do is they send one of the workers to take the tip cuttings that are then directly planted onto a flat, and there's going to be about either 36 or 64 depending on how quickly you want it to fill in. And as soon as those cuttings are rooted and grow a little, then that flat is ready to be sent out to Home Depot and any of the other retail areas. So that's LT Growers. And here's some of the product that is ready to be shipped already with flowers. And their ice plant stock looks quite nice, just on the ground with very little water, so they can go through there and harvest 100,000 cuttings, no problem, because that's just one view. Here's a different view of their area, which it's quite nice. So LT Growers. A few other growers. This one is in Simi Valley. John Shustra, he grows a lot of daylilies and or geraniums as well. So this is just his retail operation, and he's the area where he grows and sells some of the nicer geraniums. For display, he also has daylilies so that you can see the flowers and say, I want this one. Now you know where to go and get your plants. For California natives, this is the nursery. Well, it's a nursery, I'll remember later. So here's some of the natives in liners. So they're already germinated from seeds. Here are some others, and even some of the cuttings. So some of the cuttings, not all of them did that well. You see a lot of the sponge rock or the white product. So they take cuttings and they process them and get them to root, and eventually they will have a bunch of other native plants. Here is buckwheat that is grown and it's already rooted and set to go. And just here's a few more. For some of the more difficult cuttings, then that greenhouse, not a greenhouse, but that plastic cover area in the back, it's used. In the center, there is a spray or an irrigation system that will spray the cuttings, make sure that the humidity is high enough in order that they don't dry out too much, so that they don't die on them. And so here's more cuttings. Inside that house, it's just gonna be more cuttings with a lot more humidity, a lot more mist. And in order for cuttings to grow and root well, it is highly recommended that you use or you keep them at 100% humidity. That means that there's not going to be any stress as far as losing water from them. That seems to have worked the best. And just more cuttings right there. Here's Armstrong, their growing operation in San Juan Capistrano. So this is the main Armstrong area, not some of these retailers that are around here. So they do bring plants from many other nurseries. They do have their own growing operations, but they obviously do not have enough plants for all of the retail operations. That's why they have to get plants from somewhere else. And then Tree of Life Nursery, the most popular native nursery that you find also in San Juan Capistrano area. Most of their plants are just going to be grown in containers on the ground. Most of their propagation is going to be done either on the ground through some of the flats, or many of them are going to be through seeds, also in flats or liners. So that's Tree of Life Nursery and some of the retail areas with 1 gallon containers here ready to go into the market. And right there. And around here, we can find something like this. Not too sophisticated, just a couple of sawhorses or wooden benches, a couple of, looks like roof shingles or something to move the water away from the plants, and they can get away with growing enough plants for their operation. The covering is nothing more than that polyethylene, the plastic, and the frame is nothing more than PVC. So this would be more of the standard for most of the small nurseries around here. And so with that, that is the end. So are there any questions? No, all right, so we'll stop here, and we'll see you